So I'll be looking at ethics and logic, two branches of philosophy. Morality consists of the customs, precepts, and practices that deal with matters of good and bad, and wrong and right. Good and evil, and all that stuff. Now, much like with aesthetics, morality and ethics begins with descriptive morality, which is a description of an actual morality. The characteristics of the moral views of a people at a particular time and place. And this is the kind of thing that's done in the social sciences. For example, an historian might write about the moral views of the ancient Romans, how they looked at good and bad, right and wrong. Or someone may look at the descriptive ethics of today. What, for example, middle-class white Americans in general think about good and bad, right and wrong, or their views about the ethics of particular practices. And these are purely descriptive. It's no judgment, it's simply saying this is what these people this time look at as good and evil, right and wrong, etc. Now, ethics is the entire realm of morality and moral philosophy. Although people often, kind of smush together morality and ethics. And as a practical matter, that's fine. Now, much like with aesthetics, we can split up ethics into the meta, the normative, and the applied. Meta-ethics is the most abstract. This is the investigation and creation and assessment of moral theories. Theories like we'll see in the course, utilitarianism, and deontology. And there are many other moral theories, and if you're interested in such things, there's also an ethics course that is regularly offered. Moving closer to Earth, there's normative ethics, the creation and application of moral standards, norms. And then closest to Earth, the most concrete, is applied ethics, which is applying moral standards to particular cases and situations. For example, trying to decide whether stem cell research is morally acceptable, trying to decide whether invasions of privacy by corporations are acceptable, or questions like classic ones like, is capital punishment morally acceptable, is euthanasia morally acceptable, and so on. And you can make almost anything into an ethical matter by asking whether it's good or bad. So what is moral philosophy and ethics as a branch of philosophy? Well, it's a rational and systematic attempt to understand moral terms, statements, principles, and theories. And of course, it involves analyzing those terms, concept, principles, and theories, and creating them and applying them. Now, there are many classic moral problems. One is kind of abstract. A meta problem is the objective-subjective dispute. Is ethics something objective? Are good and evil features of the world where you can say truly or falsely that something is good or bad? Or is it subjective? Is good and evil just how people look at things? Good for me, but bad for you. And that's been a debate running in ethics since ethics began. And as you might imagine, people disagree quite a bit about that, even with themselves sometimes. There's also the problem of the basis of morality. What is the foundation of morality? What, if anything, makes things good? What makes things bad? There's also, if we want to get Platonic, the classic Euthyphro Problem, which is developed into this. Is something good because God says it's good, or does God say it's good because it's good? And this was first presented by Plato, as I noted, in the dialogue, the Euthyphro. And it was originally a question about the nature of piety, talking about, dealing with religion, etc. But it's now presented as a problem for what is called divine command theory. That's the moral view that things are good because God tells you to do them. That's what makes them good. And what makes something evil is that God forbids it. So it's all about his commands, hence divine command theory. And this raises some interesting problems about the relationship between morality and religion, which, if you take the ethics course, you'll get get to see in some detail. There's also the problem of the scope of morality, determining who and what counts. So when we're deciding, how to act, who do we consider? Most of us who aren't monsters at least consider other people. Some people may consider not just other people, but may consider certain animals, or maybe all animals, or everything. And so the scope of morality is about how many things, count ethically. And as you might imagine, there's a lot of debate about that. As a concrete example, many of the debates about eating, meat focus on the scope of morality. Do, pigs and cows and stuff, do they have a moral status that should protect them? Or is it okay to eat them? And there are all kinds of, classic moral problems that I mentioned that people write a lot of papers about. Things like euthanasia, capital punishment, suicide, abortion, lying, and stealing. And, of course, every year brings out, more moral problems. As technology advances, as you get things like genetic engineering, drones, Facebook, etc., those raise new moral questions. And, of course, when things happen in the world, people get thinking about ethics as well. For example, this is being recorded during the COVID-19 pandemic, and there's many moral questions going on here. Like, one of the biggest ones is, morally, how many people should we be willing to allow to die to get the economy going again? Or when we have a limited amount of medical resources, who should get them? And these moral questions, do arise throughout history because we're always facing crises, we always have a shortage of resources, but particular scenarios, bring them to people's attention. Now, there are many moral questions. What is good? What is evil? What is the correct life to live? As a particular question, is stem cell research morally acceptable? Is genetically engineered food morally acceptable? What is the basis, if anything, of morality? Is morality objective or subjective? Is it morally acceptable to use torture as a means of combating terrorism? Is euthanasia, mercy killing, morally acceptable? Are there moral rights? If we've got them, what are they? Is it morally acceptable to cheat in a relationship? Is cloning morally acceptable? And so on for a multitude of questions. Now, in the course of the course, we'll do a look at ethics, specifically focusing on two of the big dogs of morality, namely utilitarianism, which can be presented as the greatest good for the greatest number, or alternatively, the ends justify the means. And we'll look at our good dead friend, John Stuart Mill, as our example. There's also deontology, the other big dog, which is essentially about following the correct moral rules. And we'll look at our good dead friend, Immanuel Kant. We now turn to logic. Now, in philosophy, logic is the study and assessment of arguments, philosophical arguments. And we'll see when we talk about argument basics what an argument is. But briefly, the idea is that when you argue philosophically, as opposed to like fighting and battling, you give reasons or evidence to support a claim. You try to prove something, through reason and evidence. Now, logic in philosophy ranges from very basic critical thinking, avoiding, simple fallacies, engaging in basic causal reasoning, using arguments by analogy. From these basic things, all the way to very advanced symbolic systems. Now, there are many varieties of logic. One that's rather important and very useful is critical thinking, which involves rationally assessing claims to determine whether you should accept, reject, or suspend judgment about a particular claim. And critical thinking is really important because it can literally save your life. And there's also a course called Critical Inquiry, which teaches critical thinking. One of the most basic of the formal logics, what's called deductive logic, and we'll see more of that in the future, is categorical logic. It's not logic about cats, although you can use it on cats. Well, not really on cats, but about cats. It's a logic of class membership, being in a category or out of a category. And it uses all, no, some, and some are, and was developed by our good dead friend Aristotle. If you take the critical thinking class, you'll get a look at the basics of this. If you take the logic class, you'll get a look at this as well. A more sophisticated form of logic is called truth functional logic. It's a logic in which the truth of the more complex claims is based on the truth values of the simpler claims. Or put another way, the truth of the complex claims is a function of the truth values of the simpler claims. This was developed by philosophers over the centuries, folks like Leibniz and Russell. And if you're listening to this now, you are using some logic, because computers, phones, etc., which are really just computers now, they all run logic. And we'll see in the future that since philosophers developed this logic, which enabled all this stuff to occur, one of the uses of philosophy, one of the valuable things about philosophy, is making the information age possible. Modal logic is another form of logic. It's a logic which is about possibility and necessity. It's a logic of what can, cannot, and must be. There's also fuzzy logic, which accepts values other than just true or false. Binary logic just has, as it implies, just has two settings, true and false. And you can do a lot with binary logic. Again, your computer, unless it's very unusual or from the future, is running binary logic. Now, there's also been attempts to make what could be called exotic logics, such as moral logics for ethical reasoning, perfect logics that reveal the nature and structure of reality. And there's long been a quest to develop these logics where you could solve problems. And we'll see in the future when we talk about our good dead friend Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. He had a dream of developing a logical system, a logical language that would be able to solve all problems, which is, a pretty good goal. So what are some general questions in logic? Well, they'd be things like, what is a good argument? What is a fallacy? What is a valid argument? What is a sound argument? More philosophically, do logical languages mirror reality, or are we just making stuff up? Can logic be used to do significant and substantial work in philosophy, or are we just pushing around, empty symbols? To see more logic, consider the critical thinking and class, critical inquiry, and also, of course, the logic class. So that takes us to the end of looking at ethics, all about good and evil, and logic, all about arguments.